What's up, guys? We're here to talk about natural selection. We are going to break into this part of the review and hopefully things continue cruising just as easily as before. I spent a little extra time trying to shine up my head and making sure that the glare is perfect for this video. So if you see any, little glints of white kicking out of the corner of this video, you'll know I did my job well. All right, let's see what we've got here. They start out by asking us to define evolution as it relates to the gene pool. In my opinion, evolution should always be talked about in relation to the gene pool. Evolution, change in the allele frequencies of a gene pool over time. Yes, we know that organisms change over time. That's the short version of this. But to be honest, organisms don't just change on their own. What's actually changing are the genes or alleles that are available in an area. The ones who have genes or alleles that are going to be functioning better in these areas are going to survive better. They're going to outcompete the other individuals that live there, and therefore more of them will survive to reproduction. If I have more of a certain type of allele or gene available, we shouldn't be surprised if the general population shifts to be more like that over time, as those are the ones that keep getting copied back into our population. So change in the allele frequencies of a gene pool over time, not just change that happens to a population. Turns out since we're controlled by DNA and we look the way that we do because of our DNA, the DNA would also have to be shifting and changing, usually based on who survives and who doesn't in our populations over time. Describe the conditions required for natural selection. Okay, these work. I've got one more that I'm going to add at the bottom because I feel like it helps tie it up a little bit better, but let's see what we've got. Overproduction of offspring. Having more babies than can survive. This creates competition. So you have to use your traits. This is how we find out who's better suited to the environment. If there's no competition, if your carrying capacity is way up here and you could just have as many babies as you wanted and everybody's going to get food and have a place to live, well, then there's no real need to use your traits. Which version of our organisms is actually the better version is irrelevant. But that beginning would be overproduction of offspring, which is going to create this level of competition, which is going to lead to eventually the better versions doing better in this environment. Inherited variation. We need differences. Without being able to pass differences down, everyone would be the same. And if everybody's the same, then there's no evolution that's happening. There would be no need for natural selection. The struggle to survive. Kind of alluded to this a moment ago, but those, oh, we lost our text box. Take two. Those with the more useful forms of a trait will outcompete and survive better, leading to them having more babies, passing on the good forms of that trait. I kind of summed up what I was going to say about a fourth one here. Struggle to survive, you got to stay alive. You got to get what you need. Those limiting factors that are out there, like food and space and mates and everything else, you're going to have to go after. And if you're built to do well, you will survive and you will do well. The fourth one that I would have added would have been differential reproductive success, but I kind of summed it up in here. It's going to lead to in those individuals having more babies and passing on that good form of the trait. And that is where we start to see the differences in our populations. We'll see those changes in the gene pool over time that way. Clearing out our screen here. Mechanisms for evolution. A nice little matching section here. Let's see what we can do. Changes in the DNA for a gene that codes for mouse fur color. If we get changes to a gene, that means we have had a difference in the DNA that codes for that gene. Any changes or differences to our DNA is known as a mutation. B, female peahens select male peacocks based on the beauty of their tails. This is called sexual selection. Not necessarily sexual as in like intercourse, but sexual as in male preference or female preference leading to mate choices. Usually in nature, we say things like survival of the fittest. If you're surviving the best, then you get the mates. But sometimes, especially with humans and some other organisms, we may just make choices based on what we like. Oh, that looks cooler. Oh, that person's so much more entertaining. Oh, no, we just vibe. That clicks. That type of a thing. That's what we're talking about as we would talk about sexual selection. The founder of a small population has a rare genetic trait that's passed down to the majority of the population. I guess this could be an example of this. We're talking about genetic drift here. We mentioned gene flow. We'll get to that one here in a second. But with genetic drift, we're either talking about founder's effect or we're talking about bottlenecking events where like a chunk of your population died and whoever was left. They're talking about founder's effect here, which is a type of genetic drift. If a small group of individuals leaves to move somewhere else and starts their own population, that new population is going to be based off of their gene pool that they brought with them, even if people who live in other areas don't necessarily show that gene as much. It could be far more common in certain populations. We gave the example of Amish communities and polydactyly, having 6 fingers on each hand. That was more common, and since they don't tend to mix with the rest of the general population, they kind of had a founder's effect situation happen, and we see that gene far more often in their populations than in the general population. Part D, wind blows pollen from one population of plants to another. This is going to be gene flow. When we talk about gene flow, that name, in my opinion, is fairly literal. When genes flow from one population to another. This could be with animals as well. Like if we had one goose that got blown off course and it ended up joining a different population, it would be bringing genes that may not have been available in that population before. If we had somebody way back in the day before modern travel ended up on a boat that got blown off course and they ended up part of a new population somewhere, they're bringing genes that weren't previously available. And we're seeing these genes flow from one population into a different population, potentially bringing new traits to them. And then our last one here, giraffes with long necks are able to get more food, survive, and pass the trait down. This is going to be natural selection. One thing that I do want to make sure to bring up here, we talked about some scientists that were trying to figure out natural selection, and we had one that was talking about use versus disuse. It was Lamarck. He was talking about an incorrect example. Oh yeah, giraffes, they stretch out their necks over the course of their lifetime and then they pass the longer neck on to their kids. Nope, that's not natural selection. This version is natural selection, where if you did have a useful long neck, you got your food more easily, which made it more likely for you to survive. Since more individuals with long necks survived, we ended up with more long neck babies as those individuals reproduced. And that's why we see more long necks these days. Natural selection is about surviving and passing your traits on, not just passing traits on. It has to be linked to your survival and it has to be related to your genetics to be able to get passed on. Clearing our screen. We slide down to 4 and 5 here. Mutation and genetic recombination. Why would substantial genetic variation in a population be considered healthy? That's actually a really good question. Most of the time when we talk about genetic variation, we want to view it for what it really is. Genetic variation is options. We don't always know what's going to be considered useful in a population. We don't know if there's going to be a drought and things about our environment are going to change. We don't know if there's going to be a forest fire that takes out a bunch of the big trees, which could change the way that organisms live in those areas. But if we have a bunch of genetic variation, that means we have options. If we have options, that means regardless of what happens in the environment, we probably have individuals who will be able to survive. So having genetic variation gives you options. If we were like, yeah, no, we have the best versions of stuff, we don't need to keep those other versions around here. Okay, that's cool as long as your environment doesn't change. But if it does change, you may lose your entire population, or the size of your population may get drastically reduced as a different species or version of organism takes over because they did have those other traits which help them survive better. How can mutation benefit a species? Well, most mutations are not good. But at the same time, we said most, which means not all of them are bad. Mutations can bring new options that didn't exist before. Those new options that now exist can completely revolutionize and change the way that things live there. Some examples of stuff that could be a new mutation that actually helped out. Maybe your new mutation gives you a new food source. Maybe you got a new enzyme, so now you can eat new food. If you weren't able to take advantage of a certain food source before, but now you can, your life just got exponentially easier because these things are now available to you, and now you don't have to work as hard to find your food. Usually people are like, oh yeah, and then this thing developed wings and now it can fly. That's massive when it comes to evolution. If we're talking about a mutation, it's usually small changes that lead you to being able to use what you already have in a more effective way. So food is definitely an option here. Maybe a new molecule for your cell walls. That's going to allow you to live in some different environments. There's lots of different examples of things that can happen here. But if a mutation brings in an option that didn't exist before, and those options are useful for where you live, that would be considered a very beneficial mutation. And we wouldn't be surprised to see something like that get passed through your population fairly quickly. I am going to clear this and we'll attempt to run this vocab down underneath before we let you go from this video. Fitness. Fitness gives the idea of how well you are built to survive and reproduce in a specific environment. Biological fitness gives us that idea of how suited you are and if you have the things that you need to live. It is not just about being in shape. It is about your genes and what options you are capable of. We kind of said natural selection up at the top earlier. Change in the gene pool of a population over time. Adaptation. Any trait that helps the survival of something in a population. So, like we said in an example a little bit ago, if you getting a new molecule for your cell wall allows you to live in another environment and survive better, that would automatically be considered an adaptation. If somebody else developed a different chemical for their cell wall, but it didn't actually help them, we wouldn't call that an adaptation because it's not helping you adapt or deal with what's in your own environment. Gene flow. Genes flowing or moving from one population to another. Genetic drift. The amount of specific alleles in a population being changed by random chance. It's random chance. We're talking about a bottlenecking event or we'll say by a random chance event or founder's effect, which had to do with moving or starting your new population in a new place and which genes you actually bring with you. Non-random mating. This is technically outside of natural selection, but non-random mating is when mate choice is decided by things other than survival or function. Sometimes it's about what you look like. Sometimes it's about where you live. Sometimes it's about how good your mating call or mating dance or whatever else is, and has nothing to do with the fact that you actually have pretty suspect genes and might not actually produce good kids. That happens sometimes. Mutation, any change to DNA, and the gene pool, all the alleles or genes located within your mating area / situation. Your gene pool is only really what's available to you. Like, for example, if you lived in the middle of Asia where people tend to have brown or black eyes, and you really wanted your kid to have blue eyes, if blue eye genes are not available in that area, they would not be considered part of your gene pool. So things like gene flow or genetic drift, actually probably more gene flow, bringing those alleles into a new population that currently didn't have them might be a way to actually change things within your gene pool. All right, guys, that was some evolution stuff. We'll be coming back together with 3.3, and I will catch you next time.